Was the initial plan to pull the car around back, and then they had to abort mission, and the driver came up on the circle driveway instead, and then they went out the front door. Part of the plan was to remove Nancy via the front door.
There is one set of tire tracks on that driveway, not two. Not several from the comings and goings of a normal day at a busy property in the middle of an active missing persons investigation. One set. That is what a former special agent with the FBI's evidence response team saw when she analyzed the drone footage from Nancy Guthrie's property in Tucson, Arizona. And that single detail, one set of tire impressions on a decomposed granite driveway, is the forensic question that has been sitting unanswered since the very first day of this investigation. The most important new clue to analyze on this episode is what FBI's Special Agent Maureen O'Connell said on the record, by name, to journalist Brian Anton, and why the people following this case closely have not heard nearly enough about it. If you are watching this video, then you probably already know what happened to Nancy Guthrie, the 84-years-old mother of Today Show anchor Savannah Guthrie. She was last seen alive at her home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona, on the night of January 31, 2026, after having dinner with family. She was dropped off, she went inside, and she was never seen again. The call reporting her missing came the following morning, February 1st. As of today, she has not been found. No suspect has been publicly identified. No confirmed crime scene has been formally declared by law enforcement, and the question of how an 84-year-old woman left or was removed from her home without being captured on any surveillance camera has never been satisfactorily answered. What we do have is drone footage that was captured by journalists and investigators circling the property in the early days of the investigation. Footage that this community has watched and rewound and paused and discussed in detail across hundreds of hours of coverage. Most people watching that footage looked at the back gate. They looked at the front door. They looked at the windows and the landscaping and the areas around the property that seemed most likely to tell the story of what happened that night. Maureen O'Connell looked at the driveway. O'Connell is not a television commentator. She is not someone offering a casual opinion from a comfortable chair. She spent her career as a special agent on the FBI's Evidence Response Team, which is the Bureau's dedicated forensic unit. These are the agents called in for the most complex and highest-stakes crime scene processing in the country: presidential events, mass casualty incidents, federal cases where a single procedural error at the scene does not just compromise an investigation, it ends it. ERT agents are trained in blood spatter analysis, digital forensics, latent print recovery, trace evidence collection, and tire impression analysis. That last discipline, tire impression analysis, is not a minor footnote in ERT training. It is a core skill. These agents learn to find, photograph, preserve, cast, and analyze tire impressions across every type of surface and every type of condition imaginable. When O'Connell sat down with Brian Anton on day 67 of the Nancy Guthrie investigation, she brought that training to bear on what she saw in the available drone footage, and what she told him has not received the attention it deserves. She said she looked specifically for tire impressions on the driveway, and she only saw one set. In a normal residential property over the course of a normal week, a driveway accumulates tire impressions from multiple vehicles, family members, deliveries, service providers, the comings and goings of daily life. In the early days of a high-profile missing persons investigation, that number multiplies dramatically. Law enforcement vehicles, FBI units, evidence response teams, investigators from multiple agencies moving in and out of the property. The idea that only one set of tire impressions would be visible on that driveway in the drone footage is not a small observation. It is, according to O'Connell's professional assessment, a significant forensic detail that points directly toward the vehicle that transported Nancy Guthrie. Now here is where the story gets more specific and more troubling. Nancy Guthrie's home has what is commonly called a circle driveway. It is a curved, looping driveway at the front of the property that allows a vehicle to pull in, loop around, and exit without reversing. This is a practical feature, common in properties of this type across the American Southwest. Most of the time, it is just a driveway. But O'Connell was not looking at it the way most people look at a driveway. She was looking at it the way a career forensic investigator looks at a potential vehicle staging location. A circle driveway, she told Brian Anton, is designed for convenience. But from a purely tactical standpoint, it is also designed for a quick exit. You pull in, you do what you need to do, you leave. You do not back out into traffic. You do not reverse down a residential street where someone might see you. You do not make a three-point turn. You roll forward, facing the street, at whatever speed you decide you need, with full visibility ahead and no awkward maneuvering to slow you down. O'Connell said directly, on the record, that the circle driveway at the front of the property is where she believes the vehicle that transported Nancy was positioned. In her words to Brian Anton, "Circle driveway is where I think the car pulled up to get her." That is a named, credentialed, former FBI forensic agent telling a named journalist, on the record, where she believes the vehicle that took Nancy Guthrie was parked on the night she disappeared. But she did not stop there. Because the next question, the one that every person watching this case immediately wants answered, is why the front? We know there is a back gate. The rear of the property has been a focus of this investigation since the beginning. The back doors were found propped open. The rear access has been discussed extensively as a possible exit route. So why is a trained FBI forensic agent pointing at the circle driveway at the front of the house? The answer O'Connell gave involves something that sounds almost too ordinary to be significant: a dog. She told Anton that she believes something happened at the rear of the property that caused whoever was involved to change their plan. Her theory is that a neighbor's dog, reacting to an unfamiliar vehicle or an unfamiliar presence at the back gate, may have been the reason the exit route shifted from the rear of the property to the front. A dog barking persistently in a quiet residential neighborhood in Tucson in the middle of the night is exactly the kind of thing that pulls a curtain back, that turns a porch light on, that brings someone outside to see what the animal is reacting to. According to O'Connell's reading of the available evidence, the original plan may have involved removing Nancy through the rear of the property. And something, possibly that dog, possibly another unanticipated development, caused the people involved to move the vehicle to the front and take her out through the circle driveway instead. That is the theory. And it is a theory from someone with the professional background to make it mean something. But here is the question that O'Connell raised, and that nobody in the broader coverage of this case has adequately followed to its full conclusion. If the vehicle that took Nancy was staged in that circle driveway, it left tire impressions in the surface of that driveway. And the surface of Nancy Guthrie's driveway is not concrete. It is not asphalt. It is not pavers or any sealed, hard surface that holds an impression cleanly and indefinitely. Nancy Guthrie's driveway is composed of decomposed granite. And what that specific surface material means for the evidence that may or may not have been recovered from that driveway is the question that should be keeping investigators up at night. Because decomposed granite does not hold a tire impression the way other surfaces do. It holds it for a window that closes quietly, without announcement, under foot traffic and vehicle weight and desert wind and the simple passage of time. The question is whether anyone was looking at that driveway at the right moment. And the answer to that question, based on what O'Connell told Brian Anton, is not reassuring. Decomposed granite is everywhere in Tucson. If you have ever driven through the Catalina Foothills neighborhood, through Scottsdale, through any of the desert residential communities that spread across southern Arizona, you have seen it. It is the loose, sandy, gravelly surface material that covers driveways, front yards, and landscaped areas across hundreds of thousands of properties in the American Southwest. It handles the heat. It is permeable to the rare but intense desert rainfall. It requires almost no maintenance, and it looks natural in an environment where natural means dry and rocky and sparse. It is so common in Tucson that most residents never think twice about it. Maureen O'Connell thought about it the moment she saw the drone footage. Because forensically, decomposed granite, commonly called DG by investigators and landscapers alike, is one of the most difficult surfaces on Earth to recover tire impression evidence from. And understanding why that is matters enormously for understanding what may have been lost at Nancy Guthrie's property in the critical early hours and days of this investigation. When a vehicle drives over decomposed granite, it does leave a tire impression. The weight of the vehicle presses down on the loose, granular material, compacting it into a pattern that corresponds to the tread surface of the tire. That compaction is real. The impression exists. But unlike an impression left in wet soil or mud or clay, the impression in decomposed granite is not fixed. It is not permanent. It is fragile in ways that an untrained observer would never anticipate just by looking at the surface. Foot traffic disturbs it. Another vehicle passing over the same area shifts it. Wind, which is a regular and reliable presence in the Tucson desert, can break down the surface pattern. The temperature cycling that characterizes desert environments, hot days and cool nights, causes the granular material to expand and contract in ways that further degrade the impression over time. And in the early days of a high-profile missing persons investigation, when law enforcement vehicles and FBI units and evidence teams and journalists and investigators from multiple agencies are moving in and out of a property constantly, the window for recovering a usable tire impression from a decomposed granite surface does not stay open long. O'Connell was precise about this when she spoke to Brian Anton. She said that Nancy Guthrie's driveway surface is very, very difficult to develop a tire impression from under any circumstances. She was not saying it is impossible. She was saying it requires specific knowledge, specific equipment, and a specific technique that most investigators, even experienced ones, do not automatically reach for when they are processing a scene under the pressure and chaos of the early hours of a major case. That technique is called oblique lighting. Tire impressions in decomposed granite do not photograph the way tire impressions in mud or soil do. If you walk up to a decomposed granite driveway in normal daylight and point a camera at the ground, you will not capture anything forensically useful. The surface texture of DG is naturally irregular and heterogeneous. It does not provide the clean visual contrast that makes a tire impression obvious under standard lighting conditions. The impression may be there, the compaction pattern may be present and measurable, but under normal overhead or ambient light, it is effectively invisible to the camera. Oblique lighting changes that entirely. The technique involves positioning a light source at a very low angle relative to the surface, almost parallel to it, so that the light rakes across the granular material rather than falling straight down onto it. When you do that, even the smallest depressions and raised areas in the surface cast shadows. Those shadows create contrast. That contrast reveals the impression in a way that the camera can capture, measure, and produce results from that are forensically useful and legally defensible in court. O'Connell described it directly. A really good photographer, she told Anton, uses scales and moves the light source through all different kinds of oblique angles, because the oblique lighting will pick up the ridge detail on the impression. The scales she referenced are calibrated measurement bars, the small rulers you may have seen placed next to a fingerprint or a piece of physical evidence in crime scene photographs. For tire impressions, investigators use longer versions of the same tool. The scale is placed in the frame at the same plane as the impression, so that the photograph produces a measurement that is accurate, comparable to known tire tread databases, and admissible as evidence. Without oblique lighting, without proper scales, without technicians on their knees at ground level, with cameras positioned specifically for impression photography and granular material, you do not get a usable result. You might know the impression was there. You might even be able to see it yourself if you get low enough and catch the light at exactly the right angle. But capturing it in a form that investigators can work with, that a forensic examiner can compare against the FBI's tire tread database, that a prosecutor can introduce in a courtroom, that is another matter entirely. And this is what O'Connell did not see when she watched the drone footage from Nancy Guthrie's property. She watched that footage the way she was trained to watch a scene, not looking for what was dramatic or immediately visible, but looking for what investigative work was being done. Specifically, she was looking for evidence that anyone was conducting tire impression recovery on the circle driveway. What she looked for, and did not find in the available footage, was any oblique lighting equipment of the kind that ERT agents bring to scenes specifically for this purpose. She did not see technicians working at ground level with scales and cameras positioned for impression photography. She did not see the kind of systematic, grid-based documentation of the front driveway surface that a scene with this profile would warrant. She was careful about this. She acknowledged directly to Anton that the FBI may have conducted that work at a time when the drone was not overhead. She was precise about the limits of what she could conclude from footage that did not capture every moment at that property. But she did not see it. And that absence, the absence of visible tire impression work on the circle driveway in the footage that is publicly available, is what has stayed with her. Here is where the timeline becomes critical. Because this is not just about photographs and lighting techniques, it is about time. And in forensic evidence collection on a scene like this, time is the variable that determines everything. We know from confirmed public reporting that Nancy Guthrie's property was not maintained as a continuously sealed and protected crime scene from the moment of discovery through the completion of all evidence collection. The scene was released. It was accessed by multiple parties for multiple purposes across the early days of the investigation. Vehicles came and went from that property. Investigators moved through it. The circled driveway, the very surface where O'Connell believes the vehicle that took Nancy was staged, was crossed and recrossed by the activity of a high-profile investigation that drew enormous resources and attention to that property in its first days. Every vehicle that entered or exited that property in the critical early window after Nancy's disappearance was driving over decomposed granite that may have held the tire impression of the vehicle that transported her. Every pass compressed and shifted the granular material further. Every hour that elapsed without a forensic team on their knees in that specific location with oblique lighting equipment and calibrated scales narrowed the window for recovering something usable. Former Puma County Sheriff and former United States Surgeon General Richard Carmona stated publicly that the crime scene in this case had been permanently corrupted. That word, permanently, is not the kind of word a man of his standing uses casually. He was specific. He was on the record. And he said that Sheriff Chris Nanos made a fundamental error by personally declaring the scene open before the lead detective had completed evidence collection. Nanos disputed this. He said he had no regrets about any decision he or his team made. He called the criticisms silly. But Carmona's assessment is now part of the documented public record of this investigation, and it is the backdrop against which every question about the circle driveway and the decomposed granite surface has to be evaluated. Now consider what the FBI could have done with a clean, well-recovered tire impression from that driveway. Because this context is essential for understanding what was potentially at stake. The FBI maintains comprehensive tire tread databases built over decades of casework. These databases cover a substantial proportion of commercially available passenger, light truck, and commercial vehicle tires. A tire impression recovered from a crime scene can be compared against those databases to identify the tire model. The tire model narrows the class of vehicle that made the impression. The vehicle class, combined with surveillance footage, witness accounts, electronic records, and the broader investigative work already underway in this case, can produce a specific vehicle. And a specific vehicle can produce leads to the people inside it. O'Connell said it plainly. The FBI has a database filled with tire impressions, and they can make a determination as to whether those tire tracks fit a particular tire. In cases where the impression is of sufficient quality and where the tire has distinctive individual characteristics, wear patterns or road damage or manufacturing irregularities, forensic examiners can sometimes narrow an identification not just to a tire type, but to a specific tire. That chain of inference, from impression to tire to vehicle to person,
does not start without the impression, and the impression starts on the ground in that decomposed granite circled driveway at the moment the scene was still intact enough to hold it. The question O'Connell raised, and the question this investigation has never publicly answered, is whether that moment was recognized in time, whether anyone identified the circled driveway as the primary vehicle staging location early enough to protect that specific surface before the window closed. And there is one more layer to this that connects directly to something else this case has produced, something that briefly looked like the breakthrough the investigation had been waiting for, before it produced a complication that nobody wanted to hear.
A black glove, found in a field near the side of a road approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. The FBI confirmed it appeared to visually match the type of gloves the suspect was wearing in the doorbell camera footage from the night Nancy disappeared. And it contained DNA, the DNA of an unknown male, someone who is not Nancy Guthrie and is not anyone with a documented reason to have been in contact with her. That glove went from the Pima County Sheriff's Department to a private forensic laboratory in Florida. Preliminary results confirmed the unknown male DNA profile. The sample was entered into CODIs, the FBI's national DNA database of convicted offenders and qualifying arrestees. The database searched, and it returned no match. Whoever left that DNA on that glove has no qualifying criminal record in the federal system, which meant investigators turned to the second pathway, investigative genetic genealogy, the technique that identified the Golden State Killer after 4 decades. The technique that the world's leading forensic genealogist said in February should make the kidnapper extremely concerned. And then the complications began. Complications that the forensic community was not prepared for. Complications that the leading expert in this field described in terms that nobody connected to this investigation wanted to hear. C.C. Moore has solved more than 300 cold cases using nothing but DNA and genealogical databases. She is the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, and she is the person best positioned in the entire country to evaluate whether a specific piece of forensic evidence is workable. In February, when news broke that unknown male DNA had been recovered in connection with this case, she said publicly that if she were the kidnapper, she would be extremely concerned. She said identification could happen in minutes or a few hours if the suspect had deep roots in the United States. By March, her assessment had changed. The DNA sample recovered in connection with this investigation is not a clean, isolated profile. It is a mixture. Multiple contributors, genetic material from more than one person, tangled together in a single sample in a way that turned what looked like a breakthrough into what Sheriff Nanos himself described as a biological puzzle. Moore classified it using the specific forensic term, a complex mixture. Not a straightforward 2-person sample where the suspect is the minor contributor and the victim is the major one. A complex mixture, meaning at least 2 unknown contributors beyond Nancy Guthrie herself, possibly more. Investigative genetic genealogy requires a clean SNP profile to function. A single nucleotide polymorphism profile is the kind of detailed genetic blueprint generated by consumer ancestry tests, the ones millions of Americans have taken to trace their family history or find distant cousins. Once that profile exists for an unknown suspect, it can be uploaded to publicly accessible genealogy databases, where the algorithm searches not for the suspect directly, but for people who share DNA with the suspect. Cousins, second cousins, distant relatives sharing a common ancestor. From those matches, a genealogist builds a family tree, branch by branch, until the branches converge on a person of the right age, the right sex, the right geographic background to be the masked man on that doorbell camera. But none of that can begin without a viable profile, and a viable profile cannot be extracted from a mixture until the mixture is separated, mathematically and computationally, into its individual contributors. That process is called deconvolution. In a clean, 2-person sample, deconvolution is demanding but manageable. Labs have methods, scientists have tools. Results take time, but they come. In a complex mixture with multiple unknown contributors, the computational burden compounds in ways that current software was not built to handle. Moore was direct about what the timeline told her. When Nanos said results might take up to a year, she said that communicated something specific to anyone who understood what she was hearing. In her words, that tells her the technology would need to advance. The software currently in the room is not equal to the problem. And then she said the thing that no one connected to this investigation wanted to hear. That the DNA from inside Nancy Guthrie's home is, in her professional assessment, pretty unlikely to ever be the evidence that solves this case. Those words carry weight that is difficult to overstate. This is not a television commentator. This is the person who pioneered the forensic genealogy field and has applied it to some of the most difficult cold cases in the country. She was not being dramatic. She was being precise. But she did not stop there, because Moore also said something that reframes the entire forensic picture of this investigation, and it connects directly back to what Maureen O'Connell was describing when she talked about the circle driveway and the decomposed granite, and the vehicle that she believes staged at the front of Nancy Guthrie's home on the night she disappeared. Moore said she had to be held somewhere, and if there is a second crime scene that is discovered, that gives investigators another opportunity to find DNA. A vehicle is a crime scene. A secondary location is a crime scene. Any surface where Nancy was transported or held is a surface where the suspect's biological material may exist, deposited in a space that is not saturated with decades of Nancy Guthrie's own biological presence. That is the specific problem with the home sample. She lived there. Her DNA is woven into every surface across years of daily life. The suspect spent approximately 40 minutes inside. The forensic competition between his biological trace and hers is not a fair one on that surface. A vehicle inverts that equation entirely. A car the suspect drove has primarily his DNA. A room where he held her has primarily the DNA of whoever occupied it before him, people whose profiles investigators could collect and eliminate. His deposits in those secondary spaces are not competing with 6 decades of the victim's life. They are sitting on surfaces that were not hers. Which brings everything back to the circle driveway. O'Connell's theory is not just about tire impressions. It is about a vehicle, a specific vehicle that she believes was staged at the front of Nancy Guthrie's property, that transported her from that driveway to somewhere else, and that exists as a secondary crime scene in its own right. If that vehicle can be identified through a tire impression database match, through surveillance footage, through electronic records, through any thread that leads from the circle driveway outward, then that vehicle becomes the forensic opportunity that the home sample cannot provide. The tire impression on the decomposed granite was one path to that vehicle. It may or may not still be recoverable. O'Connell's concern is on the record. Carmona's assessment of the scene is on the record. What happened to that specific surface in the specific window when it mattered most is a question the Pima County Sheriff's Department has never publicly answered. But the vehicle itself, wherever it is still out there. This is what this community has understood since the beginning of this investigation. And it is what has kept people watching drone footage frame by frame, walking washes in the Tucson sun, submitting tips, tagging journalists at midnight. The physical evidence in this case has not been exhausted. It has reached the limit of one pathway, and the people paying the closest attention have been the ones identifying where the next pathway begins. Maureen O'Connell looked at a driveway when everyone else was looking at a back gate. She saw one set of tire impressions and asked the question that should have been asked on day one. Jim walked a wash behind Annie Guthrie's house twice and found clothing that formal search operations had missed. C.C. Moore looked at a forensic dead end and described exactly what kind of evidence could still break this case open. None of these people were looking for drama. They were looking for what the evidence actually said. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. It has been more than 66 days. The investigation is active. The FBI remains involved. The tip lines are open. If you have any information related to her disappearance, you can call 1-800-CALL-FBI or go to tips.fbi.gov. You can submit that information anonymously. What do you think investigators should be focusing on right now? The vehicle? The DNA? The wash? Or something this community has not yet surfaced publicly? Leave your answer in the comments, because this community has found things that official channels have not, and that pattern is not going to change. If you are not subscribed, this is the moment. Every development in this investigation gets covered on this channel as it happens, not when it fits a news cycle. Nancy Guthrie is not forgotten, and neither is the question of who took her and where she is now. This video is produced for informational and educational purposes only. All information presented is based on publicly available sources, including documented mainstream media reports and on-the-record statements from named, credentialed sources. No individual has been named or implied as a suspect in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. All analytical inferences are labeled as analysis, not confirmed fact. If you have information related to this case, please contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the FBI directly.